The Undead Asylum is by far my favorite of the 3 tutorials, due largely in part to how it teaches players. At this point, everyone realizes that holding the player's hand isn't the way to go, and the Asylum is a perfect example of teaching players how to play the game not through tooltips or pop-ups, but by experiencing the world for themselves in a non-overwhelming way. Yes, there are tooltips to learn the controls, but even these are presented in a fairly clever way, which we'll discuss later. While not all players will have the same experience in the Undead Asylum, the vast majority of players will follow a very similar path, in which certain scenarios are almost guaranteed to occur, allowing the player to learn. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First, let's quickly list out the order of events that occur in the Undead Asylum, so that we can keep the full picture in mind during the analysis. You first start out in a small room. After opening a locked door using this key, you travel down a short hallway filled with weak, non-aggressive enemies. After a short trip up a ladder, you emerge into the main lobby of the asylum and walk past a bonfire to reach the boss room. You can't kill the asylum demon conventionally, so you have to escape through a small door to your left. Through this door there is another bonfire, and further on is a long hallway with an archer at the end. In this hallway you can retrieve your starting equipment and then kill the archer. Afterwards, you pass through a fog door and you come to the first branch in your path. To the left, you find a dead end with an item just out of reach, and to your right, you will find a set of stairs. Following them down leads back to the main lobby bonfire through a door which was previously locked. Traveling up the stairs leads to being crushed and damaged by a rolling boulder with an undead at the top of the stairs. Behind this enemy is a locked door. Since you have no key, you are forced to turn back and explore for it, which reveals a wall which was broken by the boulder. Inside, there is an NPC who will provide you with both the key and your Estus flask. Using this key, you can pass through the locked door leading to an outer balcony, where you'll fight 2 melee undead and an archer. After they're dealt with, you can either pass through the fog wall or explore a side room with an undead soldier and a locked door. Passing through the fog wall will have you positioned on a small ledge above the asylum demon, allowing you to use a plunging attack, giving you advantage in the fight. With your new weapon, it is possible to kill him, allowing you to open the door to the rear of the room, which leads to a very obvious path up a hill. However, exploring off the beaten path reveals a hidden item. After that, all that's left is to climb the hill in order to proceed with the rest of the game. Phew. There's a lot to unpack there. While it's a short and relatively easy segment of the game, almost every single section is engineered to teach players not just the controls, but the rules of the game world. So let's unpack it from the start again, this time analyzing why each segment is engineered to assist the new player experience. Before we start, however, I want to briefly address how the game teaches controls. I don't actually care about the tooltips themselves at all, but this concept will be important when we later discuss Dark Souls 2 and the things betwixt. In this game, they teach players through glowing messages left on the ground, exactly like player messages which are left later in the game. This makes new players immediately associate the glowing marks left on the floor with possible assistance. It's pretty simple, but effective nonetheless, teaching new players that the marks can have helpful knowledge. Even a player who immediately understands the controls and doesn't necessarily need the help will still develop this association. This dual purpose is used in many aspects of the area and ensures that even if a lesson is not applicable to a certain player, everyone is guaranteed to learn something. It's brilliant, really, and is such a far departure from how many games treat the tutorial, even with regard to simply learning the controls. However, let's begin exploring the asylum proper, beginning first with the starting room. Here, the visuals of items are introduced to the player as a key is needed to open the door. It's simple, but introducing players to how items look early on is important. This also gives an association between silver, glowy objects and valuable treasure. This association is later used with the appearance of crystal lizards, as it is immediately apparent to new players that these monsters are valuable, as they share a similar appearance to item drops. Next, we have the short hallway. This hallway contains very few lessons about how the game is designed, acting more as a conventional tutorial area, teaching players the controls, how to attack and lock on against enemies who won't fight back. Next up is the main lobby. Like most parts of the asylum, this area is very simple, but laid out in a very clever way. As players emerge from the ladder room, the main door to the boss room is immediately visible, and most players will run toward it in order to progress, as it's very obviously the main feature of this room. In doing so, they will run directly next to the bonfire as it's positioned perfectly in between the exit of the ladder room and the entrance to the boss room. Since they'll walk right past it, a prompt will appear at the bottom of the screen to first light and subsequently rest at the fire, which will teach players about respawning should they die to the boss. Speaking of which, let's get to the boss room, since this is when things get really interesting. The Asylum Demon is famous, due in part to both being a formidable boss and the first real enemy of the Dark Souls series. This decision is honestly genius for a variety of reasons. First off, putting a boss as the first enemy creates an association for new players. The bosses are the main hurdles that must be overcome, and that they are going to be a consistent challenge, so much so that initially players can't even damage the demon. This also makes him loom larger in the player's mind, as the very first enemy they meet is a towering mass of flesh that's 5 times larger than the player, which they can't even scratch, and who kills them in only a few hits. Since this boss is so initially intimidating, this leads to a second interesting lesson: retreat. It isn't possible. Once players realize that the damage they deal is negligible, many will try to run past him out the big pilgrim's door, but find it locked, teaching them that once a boss area is entered, the boss must be killed to progress. Other players might try to run back out the way they came, but that door will also be blocked, teaching them that once a player commits to entering a boss area, retreat isn't an option at all. This leaves the players 2 choices. Attempt to kill the boss doing 2 damage at a time, which is borderline impossible. Yes, I realize that the boss can be killed with black firebombs pretty easily, but that requires a specific gift, and most new players won't even consider doing that, so I'm not going to count it as a realistic option. The more realistic alternative is that they escape through the small passageway on the left. This teaches a final lesson, that sometimes you aren't prepared to face an obstacle, and it's best to leave and come back another time. Dark Souls is a challenging and arguably difficult game, sure, but it should never feel impossible. This is a really valuable lesson and prepares new players for the fairly open world that awaits them after the tutorial, as both New Londo and the Tomb of Giants are immediately accessible from the Firelink Shrine, but both are endgame areas that a new player would most likely find extremely difficult or impossible. While we still have a lot to cover, I want to note just how fantastic the Asylum Demon fight is. In a single short boss fight, every new player will learn anywhere between 2 and 4 extremely vital and applicable lessons, which subconsciously prepare them for the rest of the game without shoving the lessons down their throat. With all that in mind, it's no wonder that the Asylum Demon is so well known and memorable, despite being a comparatively easy tutorial boss. But enough about that. Let's continue on, as there's still a surprising amount left to learn from this area. Immediately after leaving the boss room, a gate slams shut, providing a very clear visual representation that certain enemies won't follow you if you exit their area. This concept is accented by the Asylum Demon being seen pacing back and forth if you look back through the gate. Afterwards, there is a small room with a bonfire, and if the player took any damage during the fight, they'll learn another important mechanic, which is that bonfires heal you to full health. While all of these bonfire mechanics are admittedly pretty simple, and would inevitably be realized after playing for a short amount of time, introducing players to these concepts one by one in an intentional manner allows them to sink in and cement in the player's mind. It also gives players an association between bonfires and safety, as the bonfire acts as a pleasant haven directly following the boss fight. After the bonfire room is a long hallway containing an archer at its end, and while this area is seemingly quite simple, there are a few clever tricks in the layout of this hall. At the beginning of the hall, players can retrieve their shield, which is in the entrance to a small room where they'll be safe from the archer. This allows players to fiddle with menus and equip their shield in safety. If players attempt to equip their shield without ducking into the alcove first, they're likely to take damage, teaching that time won't stop whenever they're in menus. The long hallway ensures that once players leave the haven, the archer will get off a few shots before the player reaches him, which ensures that the players will either have to use their shield or learn the basic timings to dodge an arrow when an enemy can't immediately be dealt with. This concept is later used quite frequently, but a particularly well-known example would be the Archer Knight in Anor Londo. Once players reach the archer, however, he will retreat up a flight of stairs and out of sight, allowing players to retrieve their main weapon. This is significant for several reasons. First, since this is the first non-boss enemy the player has faced, having the archer first attack, then retreat from the player before attacking again gives a semblance of intelligence, and lets players know that not all enemies are mindlessly aggressive. And this is a good thing because for the rest of the tutorials, enemies will be mindlessly aggressive. Since the first enemy players face is intelligent, this concept is set to default rather than the default being that all enemies are mindless zombies. Second, players who are over-aggressive and chase after the archer to kill him before equipping their weapon will find that they once again only deal a minuscule amount of damage. This discourages recklessly aggressive behavior in players, as there's no safe area in the stairwell, meaning that over-aggressive players will have to make a walk of shame back outside, where a final lesson is taught through the positioning of the archer in the stairwell. Due to his position, there is a safe area on either side of the entrance, where the players will once again have an area to fiddle with menus safe from the archer. Once the proper weapon is equipped, the archer will die in 1 or 2 hits, allowing the player to finally progress into their first fog wall. The placement of this wall is somewhat questionable, since a much more obvious place for our first fog wall would have certainly been before the first boss fight. However, while it would have been more obvious, it wouldn't necessarily be better or send the right message. While fog walls are largely associated with boss fights, not all fog walls necessarily precede a fight. Since a second fog wall precedes the final fight with the Asylum Demon, placing one here allows players to experience both uses in the tutorial. There is also an argument to be made that the initial fight isn't actually a boss fight, as the boss is nearly invincible, and the developers didn't really want to send the wrong message. Either way, after the fog wall, the player returns to the upper level of the main lobby. This lends to the idea of an interconnected world, in which doubling back on yourself to reach a new area is common, and this is mirrored in just the general world design of Dark Souls. It is here that the player faces their first decision, as they reach a branching path. To the left is a dead end with an enemy on a ledge just out of reach. This incentivizes players to move forward and is later stuck behind a locked door, showing that backtracking is an important part of the world while simultaneously encouraging players to return later. Going back to the right leads to a staircase where the player once again has 2 options. Going down acts as a shortcut back to the main lobby bonfire through a door which was locked from the other side. While the Asylum is largely linear, this simple door teaches players the entire concept of creating shortcuts back to bonfires, and the interconnectivity of most areas in the game. This example is particularly helpful in this game, as Dark Souls 1 is easily the most interconnected game in this series, as fast traveling isn't really possible until over halfway through the game. Conversely, Dark Souls 2 and 3 have fast traveling available immediately, so perhaps it's no surprise that they have no shortcut in the tutorial, but let's hold off on that for now, because the boulder trap in the next section is easily my favorite part of the entire area. As players go up the stairs, they will most likely be hit by this giant boulder and knocked back downwards. It's a frustrating surprise for sure, but the boulder only does a small amount of damage and is a far cry from the one-hit kill traps present later in the game, namely in Sen's Fortress. Once the player runs up the stairs, it's fairly obvious that the undead at the top is responsible for pushing the boulder. This teaches players that some traps are triggered by killable enemies, which is once again relevant in several other later areas, where an enemy can be killed in order to stop a trap from occurring. While the undead dies easily enough, its simple presence is enough to teach the player. However, after killing the undead, the player is at a bit of an impasse, as the door behind him cannot be opened. The player will first assume that they missed something and begin to backtrack to look for a key, only to find this wall destroyed and an NPC within. This leads to another lesson which is reused several times: destructible environments, which are later used in Sen Fortress yet again when the wall has to be destroyed in order to reach an NPC. Once a player enters this room, they receive the Estus Flask and a key which allows them to progress. The flask is automatically equipped. This is important. Since most players took damage from the boulder trap, they are immediately able to heal that damage fully using the flask, teaching them both the value of the flask charges and consequently the value of healing. It's really fascinating how a trap as simple as a boulder rolling down some stairs can be used to impart so much valuable knowledge about the game to someone who's never even played it. Moving on, however, we reach the outside balcony. This is the first chance for players to fight multiple enemies at once, with a mix of ranged and melee enemies. Since the melee enemies jump out at the player, it is natural for them to fall back into this open area behind them, which just happens to be out of the archer's sightlines. This divide and conquer technique that players naturally fall into due to enemy positioning once again becomes invaluable in later areas of the game when it's not viable to face multiple enemies at once. Once the 3 undead are dealt with, there are only 2 rooms left. The first is a side room which contains an undead soldier guarding a locked door. While this room is ultimately pointless, it hammers home that players will be unable to retrieve the item they saw on that ledge until they return. This is also the first appearance of a shielded enemy, and while he wields a sword similar to the undead we've seen so far, he has a much more varied repertoire of attacks and fights in a very different way, despite using the same weapon and being roughly the same size. This allows players to understand enemy diversity without being overwhelmed. And finally, we have the boss room, and the final fight of the tutorial. Players emerge from a ledge above the Asylum Demon, giving them several seconds to attempt a plunging attack in order to deal an extremely satisfying amount of damage to the boss before the fight even begins. This emphasizes both the benefits that being well prepared gives, as well as how important height advantage can be. Players who understand these lessons will benefit in the very next boss fight against the Taurus Demon. While it's perfectly viable to fight him conventionally, players who realize that they can get on top of the tower they emerge from and use that height to their advantage by luring the demon below them will have a much easier time in this fight. After the player finishes the fight with the Asylum Demon, there's only one thing left to do: leave the Asylum. A message just outside the door will tell players to go straight ahead up a very obvious path, but exploring off this path will lead to players finding a hidden item. And the existence of this item imparts one last lesson upon players: that there are secrets everywhere, and whatever you're told to do is ultimately just a suggestion. Sure, you have to do certain things to beat the game, such as ringing the Bells of Awakening, but you can ring them in either order. You can visit the Tomb of Giants before the undead perish, and you can kill Sif before Quelaag. This small item teaches that ultimately Dark Souls is an open path, and exploring it fully is allowed and will be rewarded. So that's it for the Undead Asylum. Before we finish, let's discuss whether or not it's really a good tutorial and if it successfully prepares players for the remainder of the game. In short, I would personally say yes. The Undead Asylum prepares new players for the rest of the game and thoroughly explains both the general game mechanics while teaching the controls. It also teaches very general concepts that are going to be important for the remainder of the game by letting players experience those concepts for themselves. These concepts are taught in an intentional manner, one by one, as to not overwhelm a novice player. Dark Souls is a challenging and punishing game, and while the Asylum isn't exactly difficult, it really imparts that mistakes will be punished. Whether it's through the high damage that the Asylum Demon deals, the frustration caused by the boulder traps, and the fact that mindlessly rushing after an enemy results in that enemy being considerably more difficult. While the tutorial manipulates players into following a likely sequence of events that will teach them, it does so without holding the player's hand and leading them along. While it might not be the most exciting or fun of the 3 Dark Souls tutorials, it is by far the most effective. There are a few notable differences between both tutorials. Namely, in this game, it's fully optional. Technically, to finish the tutorial, all you have to do is run straight for the Firekeeper's hut, and then run straight out to Majula. You encounter no enemies, no traps, and there's nothing to learn on this path. It's short and quick, and this is great for veteran players, but the lack of guidance and structure really hurts the new player experience. To put it in perspective, if the Undead Asylum was designed this way, the Asylum Demon fight wouldn't exist, so that the player could immediately run through the main lobby to the boss room and leave for Firelink Shrine before doing anything else. But it's not necessarily a bad thing that the tutorial area is optional, and there are some benefits to this even for new players. But once again, I'm getting ahead of myself because there's a few things to iron out before we begin. First, since the actual tutorial areas of the Things Betwixt are far less linear and structured than the Undead Asylum, rather than doing a step-by-step breakdown of the entire area, we'll instead be picking apart specific aspects and parts of the tutorial in order to be more concise. Since several of the areas are fairly superfluous and don't really have much going on, rather focus on other aspects in depth, as there are some really fascinating and interesting decisions that the developers made for this area. So I'd rather focus on those areas in particular, rather than areas which are fairly redundant. There are several side effects of having an optional tutorial. As we mentioned earlier, it means that the area is far less structured than the Undead Asylum or even the Cemetery of Ash. This makes it much more difficult to ensure that the player will take a certain course of action or that a specific order of events will occur. A surprising effect of this is that there is no boss in this area at all. This makes sense, as making one of the side tunnels lead to an optional boss fight would feel forced and unnecessary. It does mean that the area lacks a certain panache though. While the first and third tutorials slowly build difficulty until the player finally faces a boss at the end of the area, the second zone just ends. Once players are finished exploring the side tunnels, they just leave for Majula. It's not necessarily harmful per se, but it does result in this tutorial having a very different feeling than the other ones, resulting in the things betwixt feeling a bit flat. But enough about that for now. Let's start out with a short area overview, and then I'll discuss a few things I think are the main contributors to this area feeling so lackluster. After the player exits the first bonfire room, they come across this long path with several fog doors on either side. Behind these doors are tombstones with control tutorials, and several pods of enemies to practice on, as well as a few hidden items. There are a few instances where these areas teach concepts such as how to traverse the environment, or how to use height to get an advantage on an enemy. However, these situations are set up to explicitly show players how to use certain movement options or attacks, such as using a plunging attack on this enemy. The problem with this sort of lesson is that it's explicitly stating a use of an attack to the player rather than letting them naturally form their own conclusions from their own experiences. The Asylum Demon plunging attack was so effective because it shows just how much more damage a plunging attack does compared to a normal attack. However, basically every weapon deals enough damage to one-shot these guys, so the fact that a plunging attack one-shots them isn't very impressive and makes it so that players don't really get to understand the full capabilities of plunging attacks. Rather than teaching that height equals combat advantage, the player is taught that plunging attacks are situationally useful for instant kills against certain enemies. If the player hesitates against the Asylum Demon and doesn't press their advantage, he'll jump up and knock them down, damaging them heavily. However, if a player doesn't press their advantage against this undead, he'll just wait there. It's a small difference, but it completely changes the message. One of the things I find most puzzling about this area is that they use tombstones to teach players the controls. I briefly covered how they were taught in Dark Souls 1, and I feel like they were handled appropriately there, as they performed the job of teaching players controls, while also building an association between player messages and advice. The decision to use these tombstones rather than the glowing messages is honestly just confusing. These sorts of messages are never really used for the remainder of the game, so teaching new players that tombstone equals helpful tip is honestly really perplexing. Sure, they perform their primary purpose of teaching players the controls, and in the end, it's not going to ruin the game for a new player, but it just seems like a wasted opportunity, especially because they already did it correct the first time. If the developers were really dead set on the tombstone aesthetic, and that's really the only reason I can think they would do this, a simple fix would be to have the glowing messages set directly in front of each tombstone, maintaining aesthetic while still building the idea that glowing messages equal advice. It's most likely that the developers assume that players would either have that pre-existing association already, or that they would develop it on their own quickly. This is a really big assumption though, and the idea that these associations already exist is a symptom of a larger problem present in both Dark Souls 2 and 3. That players will already understand all the underlying game concepts. That people already know that the glowing messages can either trick or help you, so it's unnecessary to develop those connotations early. The problem with this is that it assumes that the players will have at least some modicum of knowledge about Dark Souls in general. While Dark Souls 1 sold quite well in its first years, I think it's unhelpful to leave those players new to the series in the dust just because they didn't play a previous game. However, this entire argument forgets one important aspect of the tutorial. It's optional. There isn't really a ton of great loot in either of the side tunnels, so most experienced players will end up running directly to Majula and only dip into one of the tunnels to grab a specific item or two. The people who are dutifully exploring each side tunnel are the ones who are most likely to actually need these lessons about the game world and to learn how things work. If the tutorial is going to be optional, then the optional parts really need to benefit and teach the few players who will use them, rather than simply teaching them that R1 is light attack and R2 is heavy attack. I've really been harping on what this area does wrong though, so why don't we discuss what it does get right? First off, it's simply a fun area to explore. Dark Souls 1 only had a few fights and it was extremely linear. However, the myriad tunnels make exploring the gnarled, twisting roots of the things betwixt feel exciting. There's a lot more combat this time around, and players are immediately challenged with fighting a mix of ranged and melee enemies. Fighting through pods of enemies before moving forward to explore more is honestly pretty enjoyable and is a great hook for new players. Each tunnel is hidden behind a fog wall, and this is pretty questionable at first. It definitely sends conflicting messages to new players that fog walls are simply spooky doors, but in reality, the use of fog walls here is pretty clever. First, fog walls always give a feeling of tension, which makes the act of exploring a lot more fun, but they also have the side effect of being a very clear visual representation of where the player has and hasn't been. Many of the twisting tunnels look similar, and it would be easy for a new player to get turned around and completely lost. Since each tunnel is hidden behind a fog wall, if there isn't a fog wall in a tunnel, it means that that player has already explored that segment in some way, shape, or form. This is really great for letting players have fun in this area without getting confused or lost. The presence of the petrified undead in one of the side tunnels who blocks access to a fog wall also encourages players to later return and explore. This lets players know that returning to an area with a new item to open up new paths is important in this game, which is even more applicable because branches of yore are so prevalent. Once again, the use of a fog wall here is clever. Up till now, fog walls have hidden a segment of the game which can be explored, and makes the thought of coming back later much more tantalizing. Players who thoroughly explored this area will stumble upon this ledge, which gives them a peek at the area stuck behind the statuesque undead and fog wall. This really encourages players to understand that some areas can be returned to later in order to be explored further. A really surprising thing that this area gets right is that there is no shortcut lesson in this tutorial. One could argue that the ladder next to Dinah and Tillo is a shortcut, but in reality it's mostly used to make reaching them more convenient for players returning later in the game. This decision to remove a shortcut lesson is initially pretty questionable, as it was done so elegantly in Dark Souls 1. But is actually incredibly apt for this game, as shortcuts are largely non-existent, at least compared to Dark Souls 1. Fast traveling is available right off the bat, making the majority of shortcuts unnecessary. The elevator in the Undead Parish cuts off several minutes from the trip between the parish itself and Firelink Shrine, but there doesn't need to be a shortcut between Majula and Harvest Valley, for example, because every bonfire in the game is that shortcut. This has a lot of effects on how the game feels and plays, and there's a lot to be said there, but for the purpose of this video, all it means for us is that having a shortcut present in the tutorial would ultimately be unnecessary, and the lack of one is an overall good decision. I guess my point is that less is more in some cases, and in this case, removing something really benefits the tutorial and fits the game. Another really well executed lesson is centered around the Cyclops located on a hidden path preceding the Firekeeper's hut. The lesson is admittedly well executed, but the message it sends doesn't really fit this game. Let me explain. Players will initially see an item off to the side of this wooden bridge and begin searching for a way to retrieve it. They will find a path hidden behind some leaves covered in massive footprints. These footprints make encountering the Cyclops itself much more intimidating when they reach the top of the path. They can take the item from behind him, but attempting to kill him will be pretty difficult as the player deals very little damage. It's not as bad as the Asylum Demon, but it's still pretty significant. Each of the Cyclops attacks will deal a massive amount of damage to the player or kill them outright, so all that can be done is to swipe the item and then try to escape over the waterfall. This is a really effective way to convey that certain areas just aren't supposed to be accessed early. Having a very difficult enemy present immediately in the very first section of the tutorial, and possibly as the first enemy players face in this game, really drives this concept home. The fact that the path is obscured leaves no doubt in the player's mind that they aren't supposed to be here yet, even though they can access the area. This lesson is one that I feel the Undead Asylum could have really benefited from, as the first Dark Souls game is very open, and many late game bosses can be fought extremely early. However, Dark Souls 2 isn't really that kind of game. It's notoriously linear compared to Dark Souls 1, and the only area I can think of that you can access significantly earlier than you're supposed to is the Sinner's Rise and the fight with the Lost Sinner. So while this lesson is executed really well, it's kinda pointless, as it's one of the few times in the game the player is exposed to an enemy who is leagues stronger than they are at that point. However, now that we've explored the most notable parts of the area, let's discuss the focus and purpose of the things betwixt, because ultimately, that's how we determine whether or not the area acts as a successful tutorial. While the first Dark Souls tutorial focused on teaching game philosophies and world design, and as we'll cover next time, Dark Souls 3's tutorial focuses on combat, the things betwixt is very obviously focused on controls. This is a valid decision by the developers, as that's what tutorials are traditionally used for. However, the Dark Souls series is challenging, and that challenge is due to the game design, not the controls, which I personally find very intuitive. Combat and level navigation, on the other hand, are far less intuitive, especially for new players. In my opinion, focusing on these things instead is far more effective for this kind of game, and makes the new player experience much more enjoyable. In Dark Souls 1, world exploration is one of the more difficult and confusing parts of the game for new players. Therefore, having a tutorial which teaches some rules about the world and game as a whole makes sense. Conversely, the main challenge of Dark Souls 3 is definitely combat, especially against non-boss enemies, as they are far more difficult compared to the other two games. Therefore, it makes sense that Dark Souls 3's tutorial would center around combat, as we'll later discuss. I would argue that one of the most difficult things for new players in Dark Souls 2 is traversing the environment, as almost every single area has a gimmick or difficult hazard to overcome. It's something I think most veteran players overlook, but for new players, the poisonous trenches of Harvest Valley, the lava pools of the Iron Keep, and the clutching darkness of the gutter can all be very challenging and frustrating to traverse. It would make much more sense to me if the game prepared players for these types of challenges in some way, and what better place to teach them than in the tutorial. One could argue that the cliffs on the side of some of the more narrow paths teach this, but that connection feels very weak, as all you need to traverse the cliffs is basic spatial awareness. You could argue that it doesn't matter that the tutorial only teaches controls, and that new players will either learn the hard way or pick things up over the course of the game. Dark Souls is supposed to be hard after all, so if new players don't get something, then they deserve to have a harder time. The issue is that this argument misses the point, and is undervaluing how much a proper tutorial can help improve a new player's experience. Despite what you might think, Dark Souls isn't supposed to be a frustrating or rage-inducing game. The Dark Souls series is simply designed to be challenging and punishing, while remaining an overall enjoyable experience. While many people might find this challenge to be frustrating, that frustration is almost always due to a perceived unfairness in the game. One-hit kill moves, hidden traps, and environmental hazards all feel unfair to a player who isn't prepared for them, and this often leads to frustration. However, when a game intentionally prepares players to memorize a boss's movement, check every corner for traps, and to play cautiously around a hazard, the game becomes much more enjoyable for new players. This is why something like the boulder trap from Dark Souls 1 is so effective. It punishes players lightly in the first area of the game, preparing them for a later point where being hit by a boulder will be a bit more painful. And that's why I find the Dark Souls 2 tutorial such a lost opportunity. They had a whole area in which to teach a player, and ultimately they teach them very little. In the end, this makes the game a bit more frustrating, just a bit less enjoyable, and overall, less fun. This area is really fascinating, but as it's fairly non-linear, we'll once again be foregoing a step-by-step exploration of the area, instead focusing on specific areas and sections which are interesting. The Cemetery of Ash very obviously has much more in common with the things betwixt than the Undead Asylum. Once again, the area is quite short and very loosely structured, similar to the things betwixt. This makes sense, as despite referencing Dark Souls 1 often and very obviously being intended to pull from nostalgia by using areas like Anor Londo, in its world design, Dark Souls 3 is much more similar to Dark Souls 2 than Dark Souls 1. It's relatively linear, especially compared to the openness of the first game, so perhaps it's unsurprising that the game pulls much more from the tutorial of the game whose design it most closely mirrors. Once again, there is no shortcut tutorial, which is appropriate because fast traveling is once again immediately available from the start, making most shortcuts obsolete. The presence of the man-eater crystal lizard fulfills a very similar purpose to the Cyclops in the things betwixt, teaching new players that certain enemies should be returned to later and might be too difficult when you initially encounter them. Once again, this lesson would be better suited in a less linear game, but including this lesson definitely doesn't hurt. Neither the Cyclops or Crystal Lizard are impossible to defeat by any means, but they are far and above more difficult than any other enemy in the area, and it could be argued that the Crystal Lizard is even more difficult than the area boss, Udix Gundyr. There is this cheeky strategy you can use on this cliff to deal extra damage, but I'm unsure if its existence is intentional, so I'm not gonna read too far into it. The last significant thing that is shared between the things betwixt and the Cemetery of Ash is that the player immediately starts out with their Estus flask. I don't love this since it once again assumes that the player has played a Dark Souls game before, and I don't love the idea of making decisions which leave new players in the lurch for the convenience of veteran players. In the end, it's not extremely important because players will eventually learn to use the mechanics of their flask, but simply giving players the flask shortly after the area begins and they've had the chance to take some damage would have been a small but helpful step in the right direction. Much more reminiscent of how the Undead Asylum handled things. It's interesting because this is exactly how the game handles giving players the Ashen Estus Flask. It's given directly after the player defeats their first enemy, which makes it likely that casters will have used a spell by then, and have used up some focus points. Both FP and the Ashen Estus Flask itself are new to the series, so giving players access to them shortly after the start rather than immediately allows players to get an idea of what's going on, as every player is essentially a novice in regard to their existence and use. While this is a really good way to introduce a new mechanic, I think it should be default to assume that all players are new to the mechanics of the game, as long as that assumption doesn't inconvenience experienced players heavily. That's about it for what it has similar to other games. Now, let's explore the unique sections, as some of the things this area does are really fascinating. I won't lie, when I initially played through this area, I was extremely disappointed. I thought that the majority of the issues I had with the things betwixt were not improved or ended up becoming worse. I found it too short, far too unstructured, and overly focused on combat, and overall just disappointing. I was wrong. This area might not be as obvious in its structure or lessons, but they exist and are successful nonetheless. For example, the placement of this bonfire really frustrated and confused me at first. Why wouldn't they move it over just a few feet so that it was immediately visible for new players? They did it perfectly in the first game and did it fine in the second, so why would they botch it here so hard? I mean, it's really likely with how the path is angled that a player won't even be able to see the bonfire unless the camera is angled hard to the right. However, I was failing to take into account how the terrain of this area is laid out. The entire area is covered in winding paths and cliffs, and one just happens to be placed here directly in the middle of the path. As in, the cliff was intentionally placed there by intelligent developers who are better at their job than I give them credit for. The effect of this is that the player will pause at the top of the cliff and begin looking around. Stopping the player's momentum like this has a few effects. Up till now, everything has been straightforward and the player has never had to stop moving. There are side paths, yes, but it's straightforward. There is one way in and one way out of each path, and the main path is very obviously laid out, allowing the player to maintain continuous momentum. However, at this cliff, that all stops. The player is forced to stop and look around. This initially reveals the massive gate at the end of the area which leads to the boss fight. This provides a clear goal for the player to aim for. In the Undead Asylum, there was always one main obvious path to follow, same as in the Things Betwixt. However, this area lacks any structure at all, so immediately revealing that goal to the player helps keep them from becoming lost and provides a very clear goal line. Once players understand what their goal is, they will begin searching out a path to reach it. The top of this cliff is the highest point of the area, which allows players to create a mental path towards the goal. This will lead them looking to the side, and what do you know? There's a bonfire right there, in between the edge of the cliff and the path downwards. Similar to DS1, the bonfire just happens to be exactly in between where the player is and the way forward. As in, it was intentionally put there by developers who understand level design far better than I do. This is honestly much better executed than the lobby bonfire in the Asylum. All of the best executed lessons in these tutorials fulfill multiple purposes, and while in Dark Souls 1 the bonfire placement was simply a clever way to ensure players use the bonfire before proceeding to the boss room, in this case, however, the bonfire placement both ensures that players will use the bonfire before progressing, while also ensuring the players have a good understanding of the area and have a clear goal in mind first. So in retrospect, had the developers placed the bonfire over here like I would have initially expected, it would have been a seriously inferior decision. Let's address another decision made by the developers that I initially found disappointing. In my previous video, I stated my issue with how Dark Souls 2 taught players how to utilize a plunging attack, and addressed how giving a player a tool and then allowing them to discover how best to use it on their own is far more effective than giving them a tool and then telling them what situation it should be used in. That's why it was so disappointing for me to reach this part of the tutorial, right near the boss door. It's almost exactly the same situation used in the Things Betwixt, with a weak, unaware enemy standing immobile at the bottom of a cliff. This segment doesn't teach about acting under pressure or even the full benefits of plunging attacks, but it does teach something that no other segment this far has taught: decision making. And it does so by using lessons that a player will have already likely learned in an earlier segment. Right before the boss door, players will come across this small path leading down the side of the cliff with a Lancer undead and an Archer undead, both of which are guarding an item. There are 4 methods a player can use to approach this problem. They can either face both undead head-on, use a plunging attack to kill the Archer, use a plunging attack to kill the Lancer, or ignore the group altogether and progress to the boss room. The first option is going to be the most difficult by far. The path is quite narrow and bordered on one side by a sheer drop, which makes maneuvering around and killing the Lancer pretty difficult. Meanwhile, the Archer will be safe to fire at the player. It's certainly not impossible, might not even be difficult by any means, as the enemies are relatively weak, but it is by far the most challenging of the player's options. The second most difficult option is to kill the Archer instantly using a plunging attack. This option is definitely better, but is far from optimal. If the player chooses to do this, they will quite literally be stuck between a rock and a hard place, with the cliffside to the right and behind them, a sheer drop to the left, and the Lancer to their front. While they did deal with the Archer, they are in a similar situation where their positioning is still quite non-optimal. By far the best decision is to use a plunging attack on the Lancer, as that leaves the Archer vulnerable and alone where he can be disposed of easily. The fourth non-option is to simply ignore the enemies entirely, but placing an item behind them both means that players generally won't choose this option intentionally. Players who take time to think about what would be the best course of action and then execute that plan to the best of their abilities are likely to have an easy time with this entire situation. Players who don't think things through and rush in or die in the process have the opportunity to try again in an effort to nab that sweet item. The entire process teaches players the value of decision making and planning. While the consequences for messing up here are low and there isn't much of a challenge, this segment gives players the tools to deal with enemies later in the game who are much more difficult and challenging, where they'll need to plan to defeat a boss or clump of enemies. That plan might not necessarily involve plunging attacks at all. It could utilize an item, a different weapon, or an environmental hazard. This is what really makes this segment shine. While this example uses a plunging attack, that's not what it's about. I've discussed how giving players tools is really important in tutorials, but this segment isn't even doing that. It's exposing them to an entire concept, in which multiple tools they've been taught can be utilized. It seems like a simple concept that planning gives a significant tactical advantage, but ensuring that players have the chance to realize these concepts is really what a successful tutorial is all about, preparing the player for the rest of the game. Let's get to the boss fight though, because it is by far the most fascinating part of the area and the single best executed teaching method used in all 3 of these tutorials. Once players defeat this boss, they are almost guaranteed to understand how to fight and approach a boss fight with varied types of bosses. When players first encounter this boss, he's a perfect example of the classic Dark Souls trope of a man in a big suit of armor, similar to the Looking Glass Knight or the Dragon Slayer armor. Since these bosses are such a common staple in the Dark Souls series, it makes sense to teach players how to fight them early. To help players learn this type of enemy, Udix Gundyr is extremely versatile. He has overheads, broad swipes, a gap-closing jump attack, a thrusting stab, and even a short-range stagger which breaks stamina. All of these moves are used in combination with each other in order to make attack strings which teach players what he is capable of and what his weaknesses are. He is very vulnerable after attempting a stagger or overhead, but his sweeping attacks are almost always followed up by something else. This doesn't just teach that sweeping attacks should be backstepped or that overheads or stabs should be sidestepped. It teaches when he is vulnerable and when he isn't. And these same vulnerabilities and patterns are present on many other similar enemies. Players who understand these patterns fully will be able to get him down to half health, but that's when things get really interesting, because Udix Gundyr has a second form. If the first form falls into the man in armor trope, this form falls into the classic demon trope. This form is much larger, much slower, and very visually distinct from the first form. This visual distinction is important because it immediately signals to new players that this boss is completely different now that his health is lower. It's not just that he has a dark aura, or now he's a bit bigger or electric. He is completely different, and this is reflected in his moveset as well. While his first form was relatively fast and was able to string many moves together in succession with very little wind-up or lag, the second form has a ton of wind-up and end lag on every single attack. Another very clear distinction showing the difference between the two forms is that no moves that are used by the first form are used by the second form. Sure, they both have overhead attacks, wide sweeping attacks, and jumping attacks, but the mechanics, damage, frame data, and visuals of the attack are completely separate, and each has attacks that the other doesn't have anything similar to, such as the staggering elbow jab from Form 1 and the tail attack from Form 2 used to keep players from circling behind him. For all intents and purposes, these two forms are completely different bosses, and that's honestly genius. This means that even though the player has already learned the basic concepts of fighting a human-like character in a suit of armor, they now have to learn how to deal with the massive, difficult to dodge attacks of these more demonic style bosses. This means that the entire process of learning how to fight this style of boss has to be repeated and redone completely. By the time the player beats the second form and ends the fight, they will have learned two completely separate attack patterns which will benefit them for the rest of the game. This is how you integrate a boss into a tutorial. This is how you let players know that this game isn't a cakewalk, but give them the tools they need to approach the rest of the game. Almost every single boss in Dark Souls 3 either falls under the armored human archetype or the massive demon archetype. Yet this one simple boss fight at the very beginning of the game prepares players to face every boss on this list. That's what a tutorial should be. To conclude, let's discuss whether the Cemetery of Ash is a successful tutorial, and whether or not it properly prepares new players for the rest of the game. Based on what we discussed, I would absolutely say yes. The Cemetery is far less a traditional tutorial than the Undead Asylum, but it is still able to teach players effectively without holding their hand. It introduces players to combat mechanics and gives them tools and concepts which will be used repeatedly throughout the rest of the game.
and basically every player who finishes this tutorial will come out having a good semblance of knowledge about what they need to do for the rest of the game. I would absolutely say that the Cemetery of Ash is successful. So, that's it. The Undead Asylum, the things betwixt, and the Undead Cemetery. While all are far from perfect, after studying these levels heavily, it's very obvious that the developers know what they're doing. The Dark Souls series is notoriously challenging and difficult, but these levels show that the developers don't intend for these games to be impossible. Far from it. Challenge exists when a player is tested and pushed to the limits of their skill. It's impossible to properly challenge a player if they are wholly unaware of the rules of the game and the tools that they have at their disposal. Only once a player fully understands what's involved in succeeding can they truly be challenged. In this aspect, the tutorials are a bit hit and miss. The Undead Asylum easily does this best, as it teaches players the widest variety of concepts, but an argument could be made for the Cemetery of Ash as well, as it only teaches a few concepts centered around combat, but teaches these concepts in extreme depth. In this regard, it's quite difficult to compare the worth of different tutorials, as they all have their strong and weak points with little similarity. However, one thing is clear. Each and every Dark Souls tutorial is well made and designed in a way leagues above how most other tutorials are designed. I've greatly enjoyed making this series and just digging really deep into analyzing a small part of a game. If you enjoyed, please let me know, because I'd love to keep making videos in this style in the future.